Classical conditioning is learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Because of this pairing, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus with the same power as the unconditioned stimulus to elicit the response of the organism.
Stimulus. A stimulus that naturally elicits a response in an organism.
Unconditioned response. A response that is elicited by an unconditioned stimulus.
Neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not naturally elicit an unconditioned response in an organism.
Conditioned stimulus. Stimulus that elicits a conditioned response in an organism.
The conditioned response is a response that is elicited by the conditioned stimulus.
Did you know Pavlov's classical conditioning was actually discovered by mistake? He was studying the role of enzymes in the dog's saliva and how they aided in digestion. The mistake came about because Pavlov's research assistant rang the bell and then delayed giving the dogs food. Even with this delay, the dog still drooled even just by hearing the bell. Here's how the experiment went. The way the experiment to study enzymes worked was, the experimenter rang a bell, and the dog was presented with food. As a natural instinct, the dog would drool due to the food. This was done many times with the same bell and the same food. But one day, the experimenter rang the bell, but delayed the food. Even without the food, the dog still drooled. Why did this happen? The dog had become accustomed to associate the bell with food, so the dog drooled when he heard the bell. Contiguity refers to the degree to which the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus occur close together in time. Generally speaking, for classical conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus must be separated by only a short period of time. For example, if the experimenter had rang the bell and then 4 hours later gave the dog some food, the dog probably wouldn't associate the bell with drooling, and classical conditioning would not have been established. Although contiguity is necessary for conditioning, contingency is probably even more important. Contingency is the degree to which the neutral stimulus reliably signals the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. If the neutral stimulus does not always predict that the unconditioned stimulus will be presented, then classical conditioning will probably weaken or not occur at all. For example, if Pavlov had rang the bell and then only sometimes given the dog food, it would have been a weak association, or maybe not even association at all. So had Pavlov not known about contingency and contiguity, we probably wouldn't have classical conditioning, and this video wouldn't be going on, and this experiment never would have happened. So thank you, Pavlov, for understanding everything about classical conditioning, even though it was discovered on accident. There are a few factors in classical conditioning. Acquisition is one of them. To acquire is simply to gain. Acquisition in classical conditioning is the process of learning a conditioned response or behavior. In this experiment, that would be the dogs drooling when they hear the bell. They acquired thought to drool when the bell rang. Extinction is the removal of a conditioned response. This was in the experiment when the experimenter rang the bell, did not give the dogs food, and they still drooled. Eventually, the dogs will stop drooling if the bell continuously rings with no food being given. There also is this period of spontaneous recovery during extinction. It's a tendency for conditioned response to reappear and strengthen over a brief period of time before re-extinguishing. In class, we learned about the rat who pushed the bar for food. Once the food ran out, the rat feverishly pushed the bar until the rat realized there would be no more food coming out, so eventually he stopped pushing the bar. In the infamous Little Albert experiment, 11-month-old Albert was the key subject in the experiment performed by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. Little Albert played with a white rat with no fear, and then the experimenters paired a loud stimulus with the rat, which caused an eventual fear of the rat itself. Even without the loud stimulus, little Albert was still afraid of the little white rat by itself. This experiment was a cornerstone in classical conditioning because it dealt with stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Stimulus generalization is responding in a like fashion to similar stimuli.
A phobia, an anxiety disorder characterized by an intense fear of a specific object or situation. A phobia is created from classical conditioning.
Stimulus discrimination is responding only to particular stimuli that are not close enough to elicit a response like the normal stimulus.
When in danger, it is natural to be afraid. This fear triggers many split-second changes in the body to prepare to defend against the danger or to avoid it. In post-traumatic stress disorder, your fight or flight response is changed or damaged. People with post-traumatic stress disorder may feel stressed or frightened even when they're no longer in danger. Traumatic stress reactions go beyond usual stress reactions and can be triggered by thoughts about the traumatic event or by reminders in the immediate environment. We can assume little Albert suffered from post-traumatic stress by the way he reacted to every white object that was handed to him.
We are classically conditioned in our everyday lives, and we don't even know it. For example, our natural reaction to protect ourselves. When someone pretends to punch you or throw something at you, you are classically conditioned to protect yourselves by any means, by reflexing.
A second example of classical conditioning in everyday life is the commercials for the ASPCA. We all know the Sarah McLachlan song, Arms of the Angels, that makes everyone tear up, because you feel so horrible for these poor little dogs, and it classically conditions us to either cry or change the channel. Every time.
We're exposed to classical conditioning all the time through advertisements, whether it be through TV, radio, billboard, movies, or even clothes. For example, when driving and we see the Golden Arches, we associate that with McDonald's food. And then food usually makes people hungry. Therefore, we stop to get a bite to eat. Another example is for drinks, such as soda or alcohol. The commercials for these beverages usually show people drinking these products while having fun. We then associate the product with having fun and being happy. The way classical conditioning is demonstrated through clothing is for job interviews, when we dress nicely to give off the impression that we are professional.
Another example of classical conditioning is in the classroom. For example, when the class turns 250, everyone in the classroom starts to pack up their bags so they can leave.
In Nature and Neuroscience, scientists try to figure out two things. One, if people in a vegetative state and people in a minimally conscious state could react to classical conditioning. And two, if the gap between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus caused any change in these people's behavior. In order to perform the experiment, the researchers flashed different stimuli on a screen and monitored the different areas of the brain that responded. The test had to be administered so as to only monitor the brain rather than physical body movement. People in the vegetative state can acquire traces of classical conditioning. This means that people in the vegetative state may be able to have normal mental processes but cannot show them in verbal ways or physical movement. One implication of this study was that stimuli may be responded to even without conscious awareness. This also implies that classical conditioning may be able to be acquired in the absence of awareness. Classical conditioning does not only apply to people with fully conscious minds, but also in people with disorders of consciousness.
W. Batsall and Robert Grossman discussed classroom phobias and test anxieties in their article Classical Conditioning. They explain how students were given short-timed math ability tests. Students panicked, with some experiencing their heart beating faster and shortness of breath. They began to say that they hated math and they couldn't continue. When they were asked what caused them to panic, they traced it back to 1-minute arithmetic test in elementary school. From a classical conditioning perspective, the conditioned stimulus is the arithmetic problems, and the unconditioned stimulus is a time pressure testing situation that produces pressure and anxiety to both finish in a rapid time and calculate problems correctly. After the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus pairing, the conditioned stimulus alone produces anxiety.
Taste aversions occur when you associate a negative experience you had with a certain taste, causing you to avoid that certain taste. In many cases, people may be completely unaware of the underlying reason for their dislike of a type of food. These taste aversions occur even though we consciously realize that the illness was not tied to a particular food. Taste aversions are a great example of some of the fundamental mechanics of classical conditioning. Their unconditioned stimulus is an illness, and the unconditioned response is that sick feeling. The food is at first a neutral stimulus, but turns into the conditioned stimulus after the unconditioned response and unconditioned stimulus is paired together, which ends in the conditioned response to be the taste aversion.